Good morning, and welcome to this breakfast seminar entitled China's Iron Grip on Hong Kong and a New Line Towards Taiwan. This event is organized by Bergen Global and will focus on geopolitical effects of China's tightening grip on Hong Kong through the imposition of the new security law in 2020 and the patriots governing Hong Kong resolution that was passed this week. These laws represent a radical shift in the one country, two systems framework that was a condition of the British handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, making some argue that this is the end of Hong Kong as we know it. In this seminar, we ask what effects these laws have both locally and regionally, with a particular emphasis on Taiwan. How will the new security and voter laws affect identity politics? How will this all affect China's relationship with Taiwan? Will we see transnational political movements in the region? To what degree can we talk of transnational digital activism? How will the Biden administration respond to regionally more aggressive China? These are some of the questions that we will talk about in this seminar. My name is Johannes Kaland, and I will be the moderator of this event. I'm an associate professor at NLA University College and an affiliate researcher at the University of Bergen's anthropology department. And seated here to my right is Julia Marinaccio. She is a postdoctoral fellow with the Department of Foreign Languages at the University of Bergen. With years of experience devoted to Taiwan, Marinaccio has strong expertise on Chinese and Taiwanese political processes. She is currently working on environmental governance and natural resource management in China. And joining us digitally is Stein Tønnesson, who is a research professor and former director at the Peace Research Institute, PRIO, in Oslo, Norway. Tønnesson's work has centered on revolution and war in Vietnam, the tensions in the South China Sea, and questions related to national identity in Southeast Asia, including Thailand and Myanmar. And finally, we have Paul Midford, who is the director of the Japan program at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU. In addition to his expertise on Japanese foreign and security policies, Midford is a specialist on East Asian international politics. So we have a really great team to discuss the theme of this seminar. Obviously, there's also a lot to talk about. So I was thinking that it would be good to have a certain structure of the event. I'm thinking that given how central the new security law and the patriots governing Hong Kong resolution is, I propose that we start our discussion in Hong Kong and then move outwards in scope. And in the second part of our talk, we will examine how the implementation of the new security law in Hong Kong has been interpreted in Taiwan. Finally, I propose that we expand our focus even further and look at regional politics and activism, including in the digital realm in Southeast Asia and beyond. There's been political unrest in Hong Kong for years. And so I was wondering if perhaps Stein could provide us with some context to understand the protest movements in Hong Kong.
Yes, the movement in Hong Kong has been astonishing in its ability to mass mobilize populations. First during the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, and then during the mass demonstrations in 2019. The background for this is the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China in 1997 and the imposition of a system called One Country, Two Systems, which was originally, by the way, meant for Taiwan and has also all the time been meant from the Chinese side as a system that should attract Taiwan also towards some kind of national unification in the future. Since then, there has been protests and democracy movement in Hong Kong that has wanted to change the terms or to develop the terms of a basic law that was established by the Chinese National People's Congress before the handover in 1997. And this basic law is a kind of superstructure imposed by China and with only some consultation of people in Hong Kong. But one of the democracy leaders in Hong Kong, Martin Lee, was also part of the discussions at that time. These discussions were deeply affected by the 1989 events in Beijing on Tiananmen Square and their repression, which made an indelible impression also on Hong Kong. It's not perhaps so much known that in Hong Kong there were also 1 million in the streets at that time in 1989. And since then, a major event every year has been the vigil on the day of the 4th of June 1989. That has been a focus for mass mobilization in Hong Kong. The struggle in Hong Kong has partly been defensive to support Hong Kong's privileges and rights vis-a-vis China. And that has been quite important. And also, I think the defensive aspect of it has been fueled by the reduced importance of Hong Kong for the Chinese economy. In 1997, Hong Kong's economy was about 20% of the Chinese. Today, it's just an infinite small part, and Hong Kong has not, relative to China, developed so much economically. But there has also been one offensive part of the movement, and that has been the struggle to get universal suffrage and be able to elect the chief minister and to also elect the legislative council, or Lenko as it's called. At the moment, I will finish this little introduction. At the moment, the movement is in a state of where the empire has struck back again, as one says, with the national security law, and also a number of arrests. So there is a whole young generation of people in their 20s who are now in jail and are expected to remain in jail for a long time. Thank you.
Great. And how was this new security law? How was that imposed recently as a reaction to the umbrella movement and protests in 2019 and so on? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
All the time since the handover in 1997, there has been an expectation from Beijing that Hong Kong would adopt a national security law to supersede the outdated British legislation on security matters. But this has not, the government in Hong Kong has tried but has not been able to do it, partly because of opposition to it. Because although the opposition, the democratic opposition in Hong Kong has not had a system where they could gain a majority, they have been able to gain sufficient power to block initiatives in some cases. There has also been another factor which is important, and that is that Hong Kong has a strong legal tradition based on the British common law system. So in a way, Britain is without a constitution. It has a common law based on precedents set and laws adopted by Parliament. And that kind of system has also a strong support within the legal system in Hong Kong. And that's still the case today. So in the end, with the enormous demonstrations in 2019 and the inability of Hong Kong courts to give long-term sentences to demonstrators, China took the initiative simply in its own hands to impose a national security law on Hong Kong with draconian prison sentences and other sentences against crimes that are simply political opposition. And they also made sure that they could select judges that would not belong to the normally respected judges in Hong Kong, but judges that would be willing to sentence people on the basis of that law.
Excellent. What about the patriots governing Hong Kong resolution? Is that a firmer cementation of, or a further tightening of China's grip on Hong Kong?
One of the defensive struggles in Hong Kong has also been the struggle for a curriculum in schools that is free of ideology or free of Chinese imposed patriotic ideology. And this was a strong part of the basis for the movement scholarism that brought forward the young generation around Joshua Wong and Nathan Lee, Agnes Cho, the young people who now are sitting in jail. And they actually won that struggle. But China did not give up. The authorities did not give up. And they are now imposing new textbooks that teach the ideological Chinese patriotic version of history. And the law is part of that.
Okay. Paul, critics have called this the end of Hong Kong. So what do we know, and what do people fear the most?
Well, I just actually wanted to start by kind of just elaborating on something that Stein said, which is about the curriculum in Hong Kong. One part of this policy of mainlandization of Hong Kong that China has been pursuing since 1997 is also cultural. So, for example, promoting the teaching of Mandarin in schools in Hong Kong. And it's interesting that this has also produced a real backlash, such that you now have a movement in Hong Kong that is explicitly rejecting Mandarin, and even proposing, there's even been a movement to develop a kind of a writing system that's more closely linked to Cantonese, which is the major local dialect there. So, I mean, a lot of this is about democratization, but this is also about increasingly about identity, with an identity movement, even an independence movement arising in Hong Kong, in part, as Stein says, as a defensive measure to defensive reaction to these mainlandization policies. And people like Joshua Wong, for example, have really been at the forefront of that, arguing that Hong Kong as people are fundamentally different from people on the mainland. So it's less been about kind of promoting democracy more generally in China, and more about, I think, kind of defending Hong Kong's autonomy and trying to put as much distance between themselves and the mainland as possible. But in terms of your question, which is, I think, is where we go from here, I don't see much prospect in the short to medium term for any kind of reversal of what has happened. I suppose we might imagine that a future leadership, maybe after Xi Jinping, might liberalize a little bit, perhaps in the context of liberalizing on the mainland as well. But there's not really much that the outside world can do about what has happened in Hong Kong. I think, I guess one question we have to ask is, and I'm not entirely clear myself, is to what extent does it maintain at least some minor differences and distinctions from the rest of China? I mean, Hong Kong is still outside essentially of the Great Firewall. So there is still more freedom of information in Hong Kong than there is on the mainland. So it's not entirely become a mainland city yet. And we'll have to watch and see whether that happens. But certainly open kind of vocal protests, especially anything that even appears to suggest an independence movement, we can expect China is going to crack down on very hard. We know that the two things that the leadership in Beijing fears the most are, one, loss of control of the Communist Party, but almost as much, maybe even as much, is so-called splitism or kind of independence movements anywhere in China. And so anything that suggests that really pushes their insecurity buttons.
Right. So when I was thinking about this issue I was thinking that China has been met with strong local and international criticism for its imposition of the new water and security laws, and for its extremely harsh measures in quelling dissenters, activists, and opposing politicians. And this really adds to China's bad image, not least from a Taiwanese perspective, and it also increases resentment in the Hong Kong population. So one of the questions that I have is that, what is China trying to achieve that is worth more than this? I mean, it seems to me that they're paying a huge price, through being so heavy-handed.
Yeah, they are paying a huge price, but as far as I can see, it's a price they're willing to pay. Again, I think the leadership in Beijing worries about, actually does worry about Hong Kong, the independence movement in Hong Kong kind of taking off, and they want to squelch that, just like they, have taken very harsh measures to squelch any hint of independence in Tibet or elsewhere in China. So I expect that they will continue to do this, and that for them, they think it's worth the price. And they will, I think, continue to pay a real price for what they're doing. But so I expect to see the current pattern of China paying a high price, but continuing with their policy of repressing, these movements in Hong Kong to continue.
Right. So how effective have the new security law been in squelching dissent?
Well, we don't see the vast demonstrations we saw in 2019. And I would add, I think that's another reason why China did this. I think they were afraid that the kind of situation in Hong Kong was getting out of hand, when you had, I think in one demonstration, it peaked at about almost a quarter of the population out on the streets. And again, another thing I think the leadership in Beijing is afraid of is chaos and disorder. In some sense, they remember, the leaders like Xi remember the Cultural Revolution and the great chaos that you had in China, and the destruction that wrought. And I think that makes them especially worried and paranoid about anything that seems to hint at chaos or instability. And any kind of mass mobilization is something that they're really worried about. There was a study in Harvard a couple of years ago that found on the mainland itself, there was less suppression of criticism of the Chinese government than there was suppression of speech in China calling for gatherings and demonstrations. And I think that's especially something that they're very allergic to. And frankly, it does seem that they've been pretty successful in largely curtailing or ending mass demonstrations through these laws. So from their perspective, I think Beijing considers this it worth the price.
We can add there perhaps that the national security law has had one important ally, and that's the pandemic.
When I was reading up on the subject, I also noticed that China tried to impose a security law also during SARS, which was another coronavirus, right?
That's right.
Julie, do you have anything to add so far?
Yes, I mean, the security, regarding the protests, I also think that the security law was was very much targeted to get under control the protests in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and it was quite effective. And it sent out a very strong message that most people, or many also activists, took seriously. And regarding protests, this law specifically targeted Hong Kong. So China still sees these protests as local protests, and what China has been avoiding or tried to avoid since 1989 was that these protests would go over local boundaries. That huge protests like those in 1989 would occur again, because the broader the geographic scale, the harder it is to keep under control these protests. So yes, that would what I was thinking of when we were talking about the protests and how to get under control these protests. And I don't know whether my colleagues agree, but I think it's much easier to at least for the CCP to control protests. So at least the CCP thought that it would be much easier to get under control these protests in Hong Kong than it might be able to reach out to Taiwan, where its influence is not that strong. I don't know whether my colleagues agree on that.
I totally agree, and Ole talked about the price that China is paying, and one of the prices that it's paying with its national security law and its whole policy in Hong Kong is that the prospect of peaceful reunification with Taiwan is lost.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would entirely agree with that too. I mean, as was said earlier, it's the one country, two systems model is supposed to attract Taiwan, and given the sharp turn we've seen in that model in the last year, not surprisingly, Taiwan, which to be fair was not very attracted even before this new security law, is now even far less so. So, I mean, there was very little chance before. Now there's essentially no chance that Taiwan could possibly be attracted by this model to pursue unification with China.
Just see how well it has impacted people's identity, both in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. They used much of the population, or if not most, used to take it for granted that they were Chinese, or at least both Chinese and Taiwanese, and both Chinese and Hong Kongese. But now, I think there was a series of surveys in Hong Kong that ended after people more and more, in a way, got rid of their Chinese identity and considered themselves to be Hong Kongese. And this is the same tendency in Taiwan. Now they are overwhelmingly Taiwanese.
Yeah, well, but yes, that's correct. But these polls that have been conducted in Taiwan since 1992, they've shown a gradual rise in more Taiwanese identity over the past 2 decades. But there was a spike after 2016 and especially 2018 and especially after after the protests. So a lot more people Taiwanese people seeing how China actually dealt with the protests and with the protesters in Hong Kong surely made them consider where their loyalties were. But generally speaking, there has been this trend going to more Taiwanese identity, and much less I'm Chinese and Taiwanese. Those who identify with China, they are very down at the bottom, about 2.4%. But this has also something to do, especially the discrepancy between those people who think who declare themselves as being Taiwanese and those people who declare themselves, well, I'm Taiwanese, but also culturally maybe I'm Chinese. This discrepancy the second those who refer to both as going down is also a question of demographics, because the generation now, like the young generation, are all kids of parents who've been born most of them born in Taiwan. So and this is very different to how the situation was like in the 1990s or in the 2000s, because in the early 2000s, because there were still those many Taiwanese whose parents might have come from the mainland. So there was this emotional, affective tie also to mainland China in some of the families. And this tie is not that strong anymore, because maybe grandparents, these grandparents have died, and young people cannot relate to China anymore because not even culturally, let alone politically. Yes.
And it was not so very long ago that Taiwan had a president whose name was Ma Ying-jeou, who was from the Kuomintang party. But that was also the case during the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, and he had a summit with Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015. But then Tsai Ing-wen won, and the Kuomintang Party, which is basically the old Chinese nationalist party that fled from mainland to Taiwan in 1949, this party is in tatters, isn't it still?
Pardon?
It's now in tatters. So Tsai Ing-wen
Yes.
had no problem to win again in the presidential elections. There won't be another Kuomintang president.
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit early to say.
That's...
Tsai Ing-wen had a landslide victory, and a lot of people, also thanks to the protests and how she positioned herself vocally to the protesters that she supported. The Kuomintang is in a very, very tricky situation, because also the Kuomintang is not very supportive anymore of this one country, two system framework, because they also have seen what has happened to Hong Kong, and they don't want this happen to Taiwan. So they're in a very tricky, like they're in an identity crisis within their party. And so far, I think they haven't found a way out of that. But what is like, even though Tsai Ing-wen got those votes in the presidency, the DPP, the Green Camp, the traditional, that's more like less China friendly, and where there are people who are seeking independence, some more, some less, wasn't that strong in the legislative elections. So there's still a lot of people who there's still this division between the Green camp and the Blue camp, and there is not an overwhelming support within the society for the DPP as a whole. So we have to differentiate between like very much personalized elections, like the presidential elections, and party elections, because not all people are also very supportive of everything that the DPP does in Taiwan. But again, to turn back to our topic, the framework of the one country, two system is in my point of view not an option anymore in Taiwan for both camps.
Mm.
Yes.
And can I just add one thing here? So Tsai Ing-wen's slogan was actually today Hong Kong and tomorrow Taiwan in her the 2020 election. And you already touched on on the question I was going to ask there, actually, about why the Hong Kong protests contributed to her victory. But you also mentioned another point, which was that of demographics.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that both in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, we are talking about young people. Often, when we look at the protests in Hong Kong, we see images of young people predominantly, and that seems to me to also be. I mean, her landslide victory, Tsai Ing-wen's victory, was also seemed to be a result of her ability to mobilize Taiwanese youths also abroad.
Yes, that's a tricky question. Whether there is an electorate outside Taiwan, which, like according to official numbers, which are only estimations, rises to about 2 million immigrant Taiwanese who are who would have the right to vote in Taiwan, or who eligible in terms of their citizenship, which doesn't mean that they are eligible in terms of age, because this also might include the 2 million include people who are not at the age of 20, I think 20 is the eligibility age. So, and this is less than 10% of the total electorate. And the problem in Taiwan is that there are no polls that show actually how these immigrant voters vote, also because for two reasons. First, Taiwan doesn't have an absentee voting system. So people who want to vote, they have to go back to Taiwan. And even people within Taiwan who live in different places, like people who are who work and live in Taipei, but who have the registered domiciles somewhere else in Taiwan, have to go back to the elections to cast the ballots in the elections. And this incurs for everybody high voting costs, because you have to buy a train ticket, you have to organize your travel, you have to ask for vacation and so on. This incurs even higher costs for people outside China. So this is and the difficulties to gauge the effects of immigrant votes, like in terms of electoral advantage, is not clear. Nobody knows that because we don't have any polls on that. But what was definitely the case during the 2020 presidential elections is that there was a lot of mobilization going on within Taiwan, also youth mobilization, like they organized buses for especially for students, where students could like go back to their county to their counties where they were registered for a very low price. And this mobilization also transcended borders and targeted also overseas Taiwanese, so Taiwanese who live abroad, and asking them to come back to Taiwan. This was very much pronounced in the 2020 elections. There is like usually, like, there is a tradition in Taiwan that that politicians solicit the support of immigrants. It's a long history, and it's related to relations between China and Taiwan, why it is the case. So politicians have always tried to motivate immigrant voters to come back, but it's definitely been more the case in during the 2020 elections, because they were like widely publicized by the parties and by its affiliated organization, and by both camps, by the way, not only by the DPP but also by the KMT, to be like an historical turning point. So you have to give your vote, and it will make a difference this time. And this kind of nationalism, or not nationalism, patriotism, and like mobilized for sure a lot of voters also abroad going back to Taiwan. To what degree then these voters actually voted for Tsai Ing-wen, we don't know.
Right. Paul, you had a comment earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to this in Taiwan over identity and Dong after they fled from the mainland. We're trying to sinicize the local population in Taiwan, trying to get them to stop using the local dialect and speak Mandarin. And in many ways, we can see very strong parallels between that and the kind of mainlandization policies that Communist China has been pursuing in Hong Kong. And we know that those policies that the Kuomintang pursued until the mid-80s were by and large a failure. They did not succeed in kind of making the Taiwanese more see the world the way that the Kuomintang wanted them to see the world, or become really that much more Chinese. They managed to hang on as the Kuomintang defined it. They hanged on to their local dialects. Also, one area that I've looked a lot at is their views of Japan, and kind of the Kuomintang kind of mainland view, a more skeptical view of Japan versus the, frankly, post-1945, more sympathetic view of Japan that you see in Taiwan. And you can see that there's that in that respect as well, the Kuomintang's efforts in terms of their history textbooks and and education was very much a failure. And we're beginning to actually see something similar in Hong Kong. You know, in the demonstrations in 2019, we saw a lot of American flags. We saw a lot of British flags. And I was very surprised to see even a few Hinomaru, a few Japanese flags being carried by the demonstrators. And this is quite a reversal, because if you go back to the 1990s, Hong Kong was at the forefront of many Chinese nationalist movements. They were the ones who were sending demonstrators out to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands that are claimed by Taiwan, the mainland, and controlled by Japan. And there was even a Hong Kong demonstrator who drowned protesting Japan's control of those islands back in the 1990s. And so we've now seen a very strong reversal where, again, in terms of Hong Kong identity, there's a movement increasingly to distance it from China. And like Taiwan, this kind of nationalist movement in Hong Kong has a very strong, it tends to be defined against China on the one hand, and on the other hand, it tends to have a kind of a Japanophilia streak in it, which we also see in Taiwan. We can I would almost talk about the kind of Taiwanization of identity politics in Hong Kong. It seems to be moving a bit parallel with what we see in Taiwan.
Okay. So a Taiwanization of Hong Kongese identity, but is it fair to talk of a shared Hong Kong and Taiwanese identity, or is it rather a case of shared interests?
Well, I'm talking about kind of parallel movements. I'm not, of course, saying that Hong Kong and Taiwan identify themselves as the same country, but there's this kind of same parallel identity politics that is really defined in distinction to mainland China. They have very, I think, friendly views of each other, and kind of benign views also of Japan. So it's more parallel movements. And of course, Taiwan is far more viable as it is today, a de facto independent country, than Hong Kong really could be in opposition to the mainland. But nonetheless, we can see the same kind of parallels in terms of identity politics and just identity in both places.
Julia, you used to live in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, how did people, when was this, and how did people self-identify then?
Well, that's quite a long time ago. No, I studied there between 2010 and 2013, which was under the Marinaccio government. How did people identify? Well, I mean, the Kuomintang was very strong at that time, and that was also very much connected with how the Chen Shui-bian administration, the previous president of the DPP, how that ended. He ended in jail. So I think there was this dissatisfaction a little bit about DPP. Well, how did people identify? I don't think that, like, I recall, I think it depended a lot with whom you talked. There was already a strong Taiwanese identity. But I remember like one researcher from a Taiwanese university telling me whose ancestors or whose family background was related or is related to mainland China. He said, and that made me think a little bit. He said, you know, with all this indigenization movement, it has become like a taboo. Defining oneself, also Chinese culturally. And that made me think, because I don't know how, like, these people kind of felt a little bit suppressed in their or wronged in the way they felt about their cultural identity. Like 2 years ago, when I went back to Taiwan for travel, I visited some museums and also some monuments, there were two places that kind of struck me how things can change under governments that actually promote identity politics. Is back in 2010 there was this they were trying to open, or they were opening this museum on the Human Rights Museum in one part in the southern part of Taipei, where they in an old prison, military prison, where there were also military the military court. And I remember that back then in 2010 the museum was very small, so you could visit this prison environment, walk around, and they had a room where they exposed some books, very, very simplistic and very like individual advocacy of an NGO or some groups. And last time in 2019, when I went back to Taiwan, I visited the museum again, and it's huge, and it's really, and it's so professionalized with guides. Obviously, those guides that were former activists or former prisoners, and so really nicely done with a nice library, archive, everything. And then we also went to the now I'm forgetting the name. Outside Taipei, there's this huge park where all the statues of Chiang Kai-shek had been, or most of them had been transported to, and there's also the mausoleum where Chiang Kai-shek like is there. You can like actually you could access the mausoleum, and he's lying there. At that time in 2019 we could not access it because the previous year the students have had vandalized the museum and also this burying place of Chiang Kai-shek. So it was closed, and you could only have a look into the room from the outside. And behind the park with the statues, that's very peculiar, because there are all different kinds of statues and you can walk around. Behind that, there's a huge area, nice park with other buildings, because the park is situated like under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. This was a place where Chiang Kai-shek and his staff actually stayed, and you could visit these former offices, and there used to be expositions. And when I went there, everything was closed, even the toilets. Oh. Even the toilets, and this is something that usually in Taiwan the toilets aren't closed. You can go for your really very basic necessities everywhere, and they were closed. And there was a lake that was drowned, and they were saying, yeah, well, we're trying to reconstruct it, and it was so obvious that the resources to maintain these historical sites had been shifted to somewhere else, to a different, weighing more into this human rights memorials of the Human Rights Memorial, than to KMT history. And this is problematic, I think, because it's both. What the DPP is trying to shift the way to actually to not deal with KMT history. Probably if there is again a government change, the KMT would do the same. They would shift the resources back to the KMT and would not give enough resources to everything that cherishes the DPP. And this is something that kind of continues to polarize society and continues to tear apart people and who have still different identities regarding being Taiwanese, but also regarding being Chinese.
Stein, you have a comment?
Yes, this park that Julia is describing is the strangest of places. And this started in 2000. The sculpture park or the statue park started in 2000 when Chen Shui-bian took over, because then they were vandalized, the statues that had been placed all over Taiwan of Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo. And then the Kuomintang party organized trucks to try and save them and bring them together and put them together in this park. But they all look the same and they are of extremely bad quality. So you just walk from one statue to the other, which is the same. It was an attempt to save KMT history from the vandalism at that time. But I would like to use this occasion to say something about Norway's relations with Taiwan, or lack of relations with Taiwan. And perhaps since Julia told anecdotes, I can also tell anecdote, because I visited Taipei, and as Ole said in the beginning, I have been working on the South China Sea. So I came there to discuss the South China Sea with Taiwanese scholars, and I also got invited to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taipei. When I got into that ministry, I was put in a room with a huge table, and then suddenly most of the top civil servants from Taiwan appeared, and they had dossiers with papers where they knew everything I had written about the South China Sea at any point in my career. And I said, how can I meet such a huge delegation? And they said, you are the highest level Norwegians that has visited us in a number of years. And what was it that cut off completely relations between Norway and Taiwan? This was the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo in 2010, because after that, Norway didn't want to have anything to do with Taiwan any longer in order to get on good terms with mainland China again. So Taiwan had the representative office in Oslo. It had for many years maintained also an association of friendship between Taiwan and Norway, which was a kind of right-wing conservative matter mainly in Norway. But when this Liu Xiaobo Prize was given, Norway suddenly was uninterested in talking with Taiwanese at all. They sent their top civil servant to Norway to represent them and try and repair and talk about bilateral trade. But that failed. He was only here for a short time, and then they canceled the representative office so that Norway no longer has anyone. This is ironic because in the Economist Intelligence Unit's latest measure for democracy, Norway is #1 in the world and Taiwan is number 11. So Norway is not keeping relations with the democratic country in East Asia in order not to displease China. Now I see Paul is frowning.
Paul, care to comment? Have we lost?
Oh, I was just a little surprised because I'm dealing with the
We seem to have some technical difficulties.
Yeah.
Paul, can we ask you to try and turn off and on your camera?
But we canceled the office after 2015. I don't know. Can you hear me? I don't know.
Yeah, we cannot see you. There we go. Now we can see you.
And we didn't hear you.
Okay, I was just a little surprised by what he said because I know that Taiwan, their office in Oslo continued long after 2010. I met the ambassador a couple times and went on a Taiwan fellowship in 2015, but maybe the cancellation of the office he mentioned was temporary or happened after that. I don't know, but I'm just surprised.
No, he had time to talk with you because he couldn't talk with anyone who was from in an official position in Norway, and they were also tremendously interested in me, and I saw them a lot in the period when they tried to repair relations.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I thought you said that they closed down their representative office. Okay,
they did, but after a long time trying to build relations with Norway afterwards.
Okay.
We're now moving into sort of more international relations, and before we continue doing that, I have a couple more questions regarding Taiwanese identity that I think would be good to ask first. And one of them is, how does China react to the way people in Hong Kong identify as Hong Kongers and people in Taiwan identify as Taiwanese rather than all identifying as Chinese? Do you have a comment for that, Stein?
In 1989, the demonstrations were in Beijing and in Hong Kong at the same time. So this was something happening in China, both in Hong Kong and in Beijing and in other places in China. But since then, there is a distinction. So Hong Kong events have not really influenced or inspired any similar movement in mainland China. This is, of course, an advantage for Beijing, because the greatest fear they would have is that there would be contamination into China itself. So you would have something happening again that resembled 1989. So it is in one way an advantage, in another way a great disadvantage, because it also creates what Beijing sees as separatist sentiments, which is of course something that they absolutely cannot accept. So it's a double-edged sword. I think I should also add here that the Hong Kong identity is also allowing, from Beijing perspective, it's allowing Western influence in Hong Kong. We should not lose here. We should also take account of the fact of how Beijing sees it and how the most pro-Chinese people in Hong Kong see it. They see the mass demonstrations and all of this as having been imposed on Hong Kong and China by Western agents, and mainly the United States. This is a kind of manipulated people, and they are manipulated also into changing their identity. Perhaps one more thing about the identity: if many people now flee from Hong Kong and take up residence in other countries, we will also see an attempt to keep up a Hong Kong diaspora identity with symbols and with people who are longing back to their homeland, the way that we know from many other places.
Yeah. I would just briefly add that I really think this is the danger of democratic contagion seems pretty minimal, because again, the Hong Kong demonstrators do not seem interested in promoting democracy in the mainland. They seem much more interested in maintaining Hong Kong's difference and putting more and more distance between the mainland and Hong Kong. And although it's not pleasant to note, I would also note that we see, frankly, a lot of kind of hostility towards mainlanders in Hong Kong, including among, those who are demonstrating. And at some level that's understandable, but it is what it is. And we also see, on the other hand, mainlanders, there's a lot of antagonism on the other side growing towards Hong Kong people as well. So given that kind of split in identity between mainlanders and Hong Kong, and the fact that you have some real tensions, you've even had cases of Chinese Americans or Taiwanese being facing verbal assaults in Hong Kong because they were mistaken for mainlanders. Given that kind of tension we see between Hong Kongers and mainlanders, I think the chance of a kind of democratic contagion isn't very big. But on the other hand, as we were saying earlier, I think the main concern for Beijing at this point is more this kind of independent splitism, and also whether this could have implications for other parts of China.
So if we expand our scope a bit, and I'm wondering, how is Taiwan and Hong Kong viewed by its regional neighbors compared to China? We've already talked about Japan, but there are also many other countries in the region. For instance, we have heard talk of this milk tea alliance. I know Stein knows quite a bit about that.
Here I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it now?
It's shared.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know that there has been a tendency towards less democracy in the world in the last 10 to 20 years. And this has reversed the trend of democratization in the 1990s. So we are seeing more and more authoritarian government, also authoritarian elected governments. But in this Economist's Intelligence Unit's latest calculation, they upgraded Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to the top category. So you have, in a way, got a kind of dichotomy now in terms of governance in East Asia. What I wonder is if the demonstrations, the mass movement in Hong Kong in 2014 and 2019, if it may have long-term repercussions in history, in a way, in a similar way to what the growth in nationalism and communism in the 1920s had for the communist revolutions in Asia that I have studied as a historian. Because these are really young people. This is what we now call Generation Z, those who don't remember the 20th century and who have the digital communication at their fingertips. The events in Hong Kong have inspired Taiwan. They have inspired the protests in Thailand last year, which became extremely daring because they started to attack the monarchy. And this is still going on. And as you see on this illustration, it has also inspired the ongoing protest movement in Myanmar, which is astounding in its mass support, inventiveness, and stamina in face of extremely brutal repression. And in this process, this concept of a milk tea alliance has been formed. And you see the three hands on the left-hand side here that hold out cups with different kinds of tea with milk. And on the other side, you have the authoritarians who point at them with guns, handguns. This milk tea alliance has then, it's kind of anti-Chinese or anti-North Chinese, where people drink tea without milk, but it's mainly anti-authoritarian, and it's also marks a link between the movements in all those countries where they communicate continually. I looked yesterday at some of the Twitter messages from the young activists in Hong Kong, and saw that Joshua Wong and Agnes Cho and the others had lots of references to the ongoing events in Myanmar. And you could also see that they were communicating with Myanmar. The same was the case last year in Thailand. So a kind of transnational, young, democracy craving movement is being formed that might, if it continues to gain strength, have a historical effect in the region. And that gives me, as an advocate of democracy, a kind of hope.
You mentioned the internet activism, Stein, and also you, Julia, have talked about the importance of the internet and people talking to each other from in Taiwan and abroad. Mm-hmm. There was talk of a Hong Kong diaspora. So, is there anything that is particular with the use of digital media in communicating in this region, in contrast to other places? I mean, do the different groups of protest groups in different countries, do they talk to each other, learn from each other, and so on?
Well, I'm not an expert in this in transnational political movements. I only know what I've like. I can only say what I've heard from talks that I listen to. So obviously there are these groups that connect. There are also activists like, for example, Hong Kongers who live like Hong Kongers refugees from Hong Kong living in Taiwan now, and they connect up with Taiwanese youth movements. There are also like students from Myanmar or Thailand who study in Taiwan and who then connect with Taiwanese pro whatever probably pro-independence groups or at least pro-democracy groups. To what extent, I don't know, because well, as I said, I only know what I don't do research on that, so I don't know the effect. But there are these groups, and I mean, Taiwan has become quite attractive. Place for studying, so it's become quite international. And also, what's very interesting is that Hong Kongers actually there has been an increase, a significant increase of Hong Kong immigration into Taiwan. And but here again, there are for sure people who many young people who decide to go to Taiwan because they think they are prosecuted, and then they and these are very political people, and they for sure try to act and align the movement in Hong Kong with the movement in Taiwan, but probably people moving from Hong Kong and to Taiwan are also do that for other reasons. Maybe they have been, because not all people in Hong Kong were satisfied with the protesters and with the situation in Hong Kong and with the situation in general in Hong Kong, like in terms of how to fulfill their aspirations. Hong Kong is has become a very expensive place. So many might have taken the protests as like it was a trigger for realizing plans that they had to move to Taiwan and other places in the world where they felt that they could realize their dreams. So I think in this we have to be a little bit. I think this is a very important question: to what degree these people, these migrants, actually connect, and to what degree these migrants are political or not political. Yeah.
Any comments, Stein or Paul?
Yes, I think we should bring in here also what Paul mentioned in the beginning, and that is that Hong Kong is outside the Chinese firewall, because China has a firewall around its own internet. And there are, as we can see in James Griffith's book on the Great Firewall, there are 3 connections only. I think it's Shenzhen and Shanghai and Beijing. These are the 3 gateways between the Chinese internet and the internet in the rest of the world. But Hong Kong is outside that. So Hong Kong has its own connection via a line through the Pacific and over to the United States. A big question now is, can this continue? Because this means that the Hong Kongers have full access to the social media that we are used to using in Norway and that you have used in the United States. But you don't have that inside China. They have their own social media that have servers and have all the data in China, and people know that those data will be available to the authorities. But this is still not the case in Hong Kong. And it's also not the case in the other countries that belong to this Milk Tea Alliance. So there is a big battle over that that is going to come. also with authoritarian governments, perhaps importing the Chinese system. This is something I follow in Myanmar, where Myanmar is in the Facebook world. It's only the areas closest to China that use the Chinese social media, WeChat and Sina Weibo. In Myanmar, so far, it's also the military itself depends so much on Facebook, so it has not managed to close it down. So therefore, the whole world is following what is happening in Myanmar on a daily basis. They live stream their battles, and they are followed by activists in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Thailand, in India, and all over the world. And even these people in other parts of the world can take part in the battles themselves through instant communication with those who are out in the streets or who are conducting their civil disobedience. These are transnational digital phenomena that many authoritarian governments will want to stop. And that is a big political issue in world politics in the years ahead.
I might jump in here and say I agree, although I'm a bit concerned that actually we are heading towards what we would call a splinternet or nationalizations of internets, and that this is inevitable because frankly, in Western countries, there's increasing demand to separate and build firewalls. In the US, there is a privatized firewall that the US Congress has been demanding that Facebook and Google and Twitter build to keep out Russian bots and Russian misinformation and that from other places, which is understandable. And of course, in the West, we want to say, well, we want free flow of information, but we don't want misinformation. But that's a very hard battle to have in terms of keeping one and not having the other. And ultimately, you know, as John Stuart Mill said, it's the marketplace of ideas. But if that doesn't work in the internet sphere and social media, then I think ultimately there's going to be more and more demands, even in democracies, for limiting internet access globally. And so I think in the long run, that does not
We seem to have some issues with the connection.
Yes.
Again, Paul.
But Paul is completely right that this is a battle fought in many countries. And one key demand, I think, for those who want to free internet is to demand transparency in the kind of limitations that are created. We must know, we must access to the algorithms of the big companies so we know how they are manipulating the flow.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me, but I was just saying that I think it's going to be pretty hard in the end to maintain an open internet, given the kinds of you know, misinformation, the kinds of campaigns that authoritarian countries, particularly the Russians, are waging, which I think in some sense are designed to make Western countries as afraid of the free flow of information as, say, someone like Putin is. And unfortunately, I think they're winning that battle. That we see, you know, more and more interest in kind of restricting through not the state, but by pushing private companies to restrict, you know, the free flow of information.
But apart from that, I think the question, the age-old question that we asked also in 2008, and is how effective is this online online activism actually? So does it bring people to the streets? Does it actually then translate into political change or not? And I think this question was still looms. It's still the elephant in the room today, with or without restrictions. For example, if we come back to this mobilization efforts in Taiwan for the 2020 presidential elections, internet ICTs, where like information and communication technologies played a leading role. Like in all our countries, like political representation by using ICT is rising. Like more and more politicians have to use internet, whether it is Facebook or whatever. In China, they use Weibo to actually to speak with the electorate, or to speak with their constituencies. But the question is what's the effectiveness? And when I did this very small research on political mobilization in the Taiwanese community in Vienna, I couldn't find an answer to what degree actually this whole mobilization brought people to Taiwan to cast their ballots. If we look at the literature in political science and electoral studies, then obviously electoral mobilization, whether it is digital, offline or online, has an effect. So people are persuaded into participating. So I guess the whole online mobilization had an effect also on Taiwanese immigrants to go back to Taiwan, but we and vote and exercise the democratic rights. But we actually don't know to what degree this actually plays out. So is it more effective than other means?
We have to start rounding off now, but a couple of final questions. What about the role of the US in this? The previous administration put America first, but now there's a new administration with President Biden at the helm. I'm asking this because, of course, the US has been a grantor of Taiwanese security. So what do you think about this continued role for the US?
Maybe I'll jump in here quickly, and if I may share my screen, just essentially highly relevant here. Not the first page or two, I'm going to click down, but here, this is a poll. Now, this is really more, this is asked, the main purpose of this poll, that I made, was to show that Taiwanese have an extremely favorable view of Japan. This is a country asked, name one country that's your favorite foreign country. And for most years, Japan is more popular than every other country combined. But if we look at the bottom, we can see that actually the US is not much more popular than China in Japan, in Taiwan. This is in Taiwan. And I think this suggests that actually maybe despite the Taiwan Relations Act and the US commitment to defend Taiwan, that actually there's some real skepticism, and this was before the Trump administration, real skepticism about the US in Taiwan. I've tried to get to the bottom of this. Some people say it's because the US was perceived at that time as being too close to China. Others say it's cultural distance. Others focus on American unilateralism going back to the invasion of Iraq, etc. I don't know, but I think this is an indication perhaps that maybe people in Taiwan, I'm less sure about Hong Kong, despite the American flags carried at the demonstrations, are not necessarily that optimistic about what the United States can or will do to support them. And I think that would go particularly for Hong Kong, where in fact there really isn't much that the US can do.
Stein?
Julia?
Yep.
Oh, me? Oh, okay. So sorry. Yeah, actually, I didn't know about this very low popularity of the US in Taiwan. What I saw polls on Hong Kong where US, Canada, and Taiwan fares fare very well. So they're the most popular countries among the population. Well, I think it's, I mean, I'm not a specialist on foreign policies, but the ambiguity of foreign of China, US, Taiwan relations is a factor that kind of creates insecurity among the population. So the question is, if Taiwan, if China attacks, will the US then come and help us or not? So I think this insecurity is still there, and that's among the population. In terms of on the political level, I think that the US is still one of the major most important allies of Taiwan, where the government also puts much efforts into like kind of strengthening ties and a lot of work into the diplomatic work. So yes, I think maybe there is a discrepancy between the perceptions among the population and then political priorities for pragmatic reasons. Yeah.
Stein?
Perhaps one very simplistic argument from my side, but I have for many years felt that Taiwan is an Achilles heel for China. Because China has imposed on itself, through its nationalist vision and program, a kind of obligation to unify with Taiwan, and it has also adopted a law, I think that was in 2005, obliging China to use force if Taiwan should declare itself independent or organize a referendum on independence. So what this means is that if the United States president at some stage should decide that now China has become too strong, and this is our last chance to stop China, and we must now use military means, but we must do it in a way that gives us support from most of the world around China, then it would be a good idea to whisper into the ears of the Taiwanese to make moves in the direction of independence and organize a referendum. And then just keep ready to strike China the moment you see China starts attacking Taiwan, and blame it the whole outbreak of war on China. And this has led me to say to colleagues in China that I think you should let Taiwan go. You have an excellent economic relationship with Taiwan, with lots of Taiwanese in China. So economic integration is enough for you, and then you would remove that danger. I see this danger a little bit now also in the personality of Mike Pompeo, because in the last days he had in the State Department, one of the moves he made was to cancel the rules that had been established in Washington for on what level you could have contact with the Taiwanese government. So all those restrictions were removed by Mike Pompeo. I have not heard that this has been changed in a formal way by the Biden administration, and Taiwan was represented at the inauguration of Biden. I don't think there is any risk that Biden would do anything in the direction of what I just said. But if Mike Pompeo should win the next election and become president of the United States, I think this tripwire that China has established for itself in Taiwan would become dangerous.
But if I may add, critics have said Mike Pompeo could have promulgated this act, or just canceled these restrictions on the communication, and how on the communication between different authorities, between China, between Taiwan and the US. He could have canceled that before, but he did it on a last moment, like right before the Biden administration took like effective office. So which leaves like the question, what did Mike Pompeo really want, and was it a retaliation, and was it because the Biden administration actually, like with this move from Mike Pompeo, is in a very difficult position. I mean, it would have been in a difficult position anyway, because it's still the Biden administration still feels China as a very as a competitor, and they still have to deal with the China that has risen now, and this affects also how they will deal with Taiwan in the future. What I know is that the high level the visit from the UN ambassador of the like the US ambassador of the UN planned to visit Taiwan, that was cancelled. Now under the pretext of COVID, so COVID has become kind of nice, also a nice excuse also for, or solve some political issues maybe, for at least for the time. So this high level visit like has been cancelled, and also there were these rumors that Mike Pompeo would like wanted to go to Taiwan, and when these rumors came out, China immediately reacted and said, if the acting foreign minister pays a visit to Taiwan, then that means war. And regarding war, there's another thing, like if we have a look, I recently had a look at the different 5-year plans, because recently China issued the 14th 5-year plan. We still have this peaceful development, like the word peaceful in the official diction. And the question is, like, I think personally, the moment the peaceful is away, the moment they skip peaceful in their rhetoric, then we have to worry. Then we really have to worry. But the other question is, to whom is peaceful actually directed? Because what is not there anymore, what used to be in 2012, is the peaceful reunification. Now it's peaceful development. So for unification, China doesn't say that it has to be peaceful at all. And Xi Jinping also made clear in 2019 with his message to the Taiwanese compatriots that Chinese will not fight against Chinese, but they will fight against those who declare themselves non-Chinese, like Taiwanese. So like he didn't say that, but it's implied in the message. Chinese don't fight Chinese. So the question with the peaceful, with the word peaceful that's still in the official rhetoric, the big question is to whom it is directed. And I think one critical interlocutor is the US, because in the joint communiques that regulate the foreign US foreign relations with China and with Taiwan, the US made clear the condition is that China remains peaceful, and whatever it does, it has to be peaceful. So there must not be a military attack. And so the peaceful in the official rhetoric is, in my point of view, much more directed to the US, assuring we're still peaceful. But still, China ruled out a peaceful reunification. It says peaceful relations, but not the peaceful reunification.
Paul, last comments, and then we have to take some questions.
Okay, I just wanted to make the observation that we've talked about China becoming more aggressive towards Taiwan, but we also have to recognize, as I think has been alluded to, in many ways, the Trump administration became more aggressive on the Taiwan issue. And by breaking all of these long-standing diplomatic norms limiting US contact with Taiwan, I think that in some sense has provoked some of the Chinese reactions we've seen. And in fact, we've almost had a spiral of action-reaction going on between China and the US over Taiwan, with the US sending higher level officials to Taiwan, and then China protesting by holding military demonstrations in the Taiwan Straits or nearby, a pattern which we can date back to the 1990s. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And in terms of kind of maintaining peace across the Straits, I don't think we should necessarily assume, therefore, that the demonstrations, military demonstrations from China indicate that China is getting ready to invade. But I do think that in order to maintain stability and reduce that risk, that there should be some kind of, the US and China need to figure out a way to kind of ratchet down this spiral of action-reaction, so that we can have more stability and so that that risk declines. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, we've been through a lot, and I'm now opening up for questions for those who are joining us. And I guess I should also thank each of the panelists very much for participating. Julia, Stein, and Paul, for many insights and comments about the past, present, and also in some degree future insights on the situation in Hong Kong and Taiwan.